Welcome everyone. Hello, good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are in the world. I'm Patrick Krieger with the Plastics Industry Association, and I'm moderating today's webinar. We continue to have great registration and turnouts for these sessions, and so I'm going to cover a few administrative items while people are still logging in. This is the second episode in an educational webinar series that's designed to share common industry practices on reducing plastic resin loss. Whether you call it pellet, flake, powder, or something else, it's all plastic resin and it has no place in the environment. So all attendees' lines are currently muted. We will offer a single Q&A session after all the speakers present their slides. Please submit any of your questions using the question box feature of the Zoom webinar at any point during the program. As a courtesy, we would like to remind you that this is a public session and press and other non-member participants are welcome and may be present. In addition, please keep in mind that we will abide by the antitrust rules and refrain from discussing pricing, production, or marketing strategies, anything that could be construed as market manipulation. We will not address questions of this nature during the webinar. Each of these 3 sessions will be recorded, while the slides and videos will be available on our website too. If you would like to access these early and in advance, you can complete a short survey that will be sent to you following today's webinar. It's 3 very short questions and it's actually very helpful to us. So if you would like to see those, we'd really encourage you doing that. So speaking of surveys, everybody who registered, unless you registered a little bit late, received a link to another survey from me directly. If you haven't received it yet, you still will. It gave you the opportunity to ask questions in advance, as Chris referenced earlier, and share some of your company's practices in those areas as well. So this does 2 things. One, each of these sessions is only an hour long, and so that gives our speakers the ability to ensure that they answer as many questions as possible during their presentations. And 2, because everyone's operations are different, by collecting as many industry practices as possible, we can build a robust resource that can be relevant to more companies. And then following the 3rd webinar, we'll compile all the industry practices and resources we have gathered into a single document and share it with you all on our website. All the comments will be handled anonymously unless you state otherwise. And the survey will be live until the end of September. So I encourage you to share what you're doing right with us so that we have that listed. With that, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today, who should all be on video right now. Danielle Gore works for Chevron Phillips Chemical Company as the America's Sustainability Advisor. She is a chemical engineer by education and focuses in her role on sustainability reporting, waste minimization, greenhouse gas emissions, and is also the company's OCS champion. Chris Jackson is the Logistics Production Unit Manager and Global Rail Subject Matter Expert for Shell Chemical. He has been in the plastics industry for approximately 25 years in various roles and capacities. In his current role, he is responsible for the logistics associated with the safe operations and transportation of polyethylene in North America for Shell Polymers. And Jerry Curl is the Certified Director of Safety and Director of Operations for G&D Trucking Inc. / Hoffman Transportation LLC. He oversees safety and the daily operations for these companies, who were the 2017 National Tank Truck Carriers of North America Safety Champions, and he was their 2017 Safety Professional of the Year. While he has been with G&D Trucking for the past 25 years, his entire professional career has been spent in various capacities in the resin industry, including transloading, transportation, warehousing, and maintenance of various resins. So I hope you'll agree with me that all 3 of our speakers today come with a wealth of experience and knowledge on these topics that we'll be discussing. So, and with that, I'd like to hand this off to Danielle. Danielle, please feel free to let me know when you'd like to go to the next slide. We'll turn off webcams right now so we're less distracting. And can you just confirm that your audio is working? We can't.
Okay, what about now?
So I think that's working now.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you very much. Thank you guys for joining us today. I'm really excited to kick off this specific webinar. You know, as Patrick mentioned, we had one at the beginning of September, and I hope that you guys were able to join for that one as well. So Patrick, you can go on to the first slide. So as Patrick mentioned, I am the OCS champion for Chevron Phillips Chemical, and CP Chem has been a part of OCS for more than 20 years, but we pledged OCS Blue last year in April, and so I'm really excited to talk to you guys about that journey and just some of our learnings along the way. Following my presentation, Chris Jackson from Shell will be presenting, so I'll be going through the first few steps of the process, and then Chris will be taking over from there. So today we're going to, the goal of the presentation really is to walk through the basic steps of the resin manufacturing process for those who may not be familiar. And then what I think is probably the most critical is talking through the management system components before we actually dive into any best practices or our approach to developing best practices for general manufacturing areas. Then I'll give some examples of some best practices. We obviously don't have time to go into a deep dive discussion on all of the best practices. But as Patrick mentioned, we are sending out a survey, so I really hope that you guys are able to complete that and share those findings that you have come up with the rest of those that are joining for this webinar. It's so critical that we all work together. So if you are tuning into this presentation and you are not a resin manufacturer or transportation provider, I still believe that the majority of it is applicable, and I hope that you will stay tuned to benefit from it and that you get a lot out of it. Okay, Patrick, let's go to the first slide. So before I begin actually talking through our some best practices, I think it's really important to contextualize where we are in the process. So if you're not familiar with resin manufacturing, this is an extremely oversimplified flow diagram of how we make plastics. Today, I will mostly be focusing on the product handling through the loadout sections. And of course, the containment and recovery systems that I will allude to and talk through cover the entire process, so they're really applicable to anywhere you are throughout the process. And then Chris will take over from the sit yard and transportation from the resin manufacturing facilities. So Patrick, you can go to the next slide. So if you joined for the first webinar in this series, you may remember David talking through some of the first steps for you to take after becoming an OCS member or an OCS Blue member. And we are a firm believer that your management system is the most critical component to ensuring success at preventing plastic loss to the environment. If it is not embedded into your practices, then OCS is just an initiative, and it won't really allow you to get that progress and that cultural change that's necessary. So we put together some essential components that we believe really could be incorporated into a management system to make sure that your site is achieving that zero loss. Where I will get started is on management commitment. I think this is so critical. It shouldn't just be from the top down, also from the bottom up, but making sure that it is clear to your employees that this is important to your company is absolutely critical. The culture is everything at facilities that have been managing plastics for so many years. This should be management commitment on a site level and on a corporate level. You can accomplish this through videos, through if you have regular walkthroughs in your facility, having your management participate in those. You can make it very exciting, like something we did, and have your senior vice president join for some of those walkthroughs with your personnel, just to really show how important this is to you as a company. The next thing that I think seems very obvious, but sometimes we can overlook, is that this program can only be successful if you have very clearly defined roles and responsibilities. Your employees should be fully aware who owns the OCS program at each level of the organization and specifically at your sites. Who is responsible for reporting from, whether it be to your state agencies or internally, or whether it be to the OCS Blue for the OCS Blue metrics, and who's responsible for identifying improvement projects and getting those executed. I highly recommend to make sure that you are, the people who are touching the process have to really be owning this program, so that someone inside of manufacturing, it is recommended to designate an OCS champion and an OCS team at your sites. And the OCS champion, I think, is really critical to have someone who is very familiar with the process and engaged in the process. And that local site management should give them the authority and clear support for making improvements inside of your facilities. The next thing I will recommend or talk through, which I think ties to your roles and responsibilities, is training and communication. This is what I like to think of as in two parts. Number one is your awareness level training. So every employee at your company has a part to play in the success of your OCS program. And therefore, I think it's incredibly important that everyone receive awareness level training to talk about the importance of OCS and what that means on each level of the organization. But additionally, you will have to have your site-specific training for those that are touching the process on a regular basis. So something to keep in mind, that for your facilities that have been handling this, amazing material that provides so many societal benefits for, over 50 years maybe, and it might be a culture change for some of your facilities. And employees should be seeing these messages consistently, how important it is to keep this material in the process. That has to be seen through, videos, through posters, through emails, through walkthroughs, face-to-face communication, training. You have to, communicate that on multiple levels. And ultimately, that culture change will lead to, if you have a company that's producing more than just plastics, your employees should be treating plastic products like any other product. We have to treat it the same way as we treat a hydrocarbon. We have to treat it the same way as we would not want any of our other products to hit the ground, right? So that training communication is critical to ensuring that culture change. The next piece I think is really important is inspections. So a sustainable OCS program can only be achieved if you are incorporating into your regular processes. So when we talk about inspections, you probably already have housekeeping walkthroughs or audits, revising that language, adding, components in there that are very targeted to OCS, bringing it to your operators and your maintenance personnel attention, to make sure that it's embedded into your processes. If you have, operators who do regular rounds to look at equipment, making sure you have very targeted equipment checks for equipment that is critical for keeping your materials in the process. Now, outside of that, which is going to be on a less frequent basis, is what I would call assessments, which are really your internal verifications that your systems that you've put in place are working. So if you joined for the first webinar, you will notice that David recommended to do a gap assessment. So that is an example of a an initial one-time assessment, and then it's recommended to do a periodic, more formalized assessment on a more frequent basis. So it's very much recommended to build this into your existing systems. For example, if you participate in responsible care or your ISO 14001, try to build it into your management systems that are already in place so that they enter into an audit frequency. But please take in mind that you might need to audit more frequently at first. So you might need to put in an annual audit at first if your frequencies do not align with that currently. The next thing I think is really critical is your procedures. And this is in two pieces. The first piece is that you probably already have procedures in place for opening up equipment or maintaining equipment. It's revising those procedures to make sure you're adding targeted language around containment for plastics. And then on the other side is having a very clear spill response procedure. Now, if you have a facility that's managing more than just plastics, it might be critical for you to make sure your spill response procedures are very clearly incorporating plastics as a spill. If your spill response are covering multiple types of materials, whether it's oil or other products that you make sure that you have either a specific procedure for plastics or you've incorporated plastics into that procedure with clear requirements. The next one, I think, is the one that we have the most discussion on throughout the value chain, which is reporting and metrics. So if you're an OCS Blue member, you have the required metric for reporting. And then if you are, you have probably some state permits that have required reporting as a state requirement. So making sure, again, that those are clear expectations and clear roles for who's responsible. But I think it's also important to develop metrics that really matter to the site to drive success. And I think these can look different for every site, but some examples could be you should be maybe tracking how much material you're cleaning up internally from internal spills. That number, ideally in the long run should go down. So as you're keeping things in the process. So that's an example of a metric that could help drive success if you're trying to catch that material earlier on in the process. You can also have, if you have an internal spill reporting system, so again, these are not spills happening outside of your fence line, these are spills inside of your fence line. That might be a more meaningful metric for your site to determine improvement opportunities and also to determine how successful they're being. So the second to last thing, which I think is so critical, and if you can't tell, one of the biggest takeaways from this webinar series is every point of the value chain really matters, and that's why we all came together to do these webinars. If you are a resin producer, you have to engage with your customers and transportation providers. Even if you are letting 0 pellets out of your own facility, if one customer sends a rail car back without a cap on and the valve is not closed all the way, that completely can undermine your efforts at your facility. So having those discussions, having your supply chain, your sales reps involved in your OCS program, sending out educational materials, talking to your customers, tracking your rail cars, tracking those that are coming back without the caps on. Those are all so critical for the success of the program. The last one, which when I was going through this presentation with my friend Laura from Exxon, she reminded me of, which is so critical, is ensure your sites are talking. So Exxon does communities of sharing. We do OCS best practice meetings. Make sure you're meeting on a regular basis and sharing what you're learning. We want to work smarter, not harder. Most of the time when one site has figured something out, it is applicable to all of your sites. And I would say also external best practice sharing like this session is incredibly important, and just communicating with your peers to learn from each other. So all of these items are really aimed at setting your company up for establishing a successful program. I will reiterate that if these functions do not work, it does not matter how much money you throw at this issue, it will not be sustainable. So Patrick, if you can go to the next. Perfect. So before I dive into some examples of practices or best practices, I think it's important to address how to approach preventing loss in the first place. So we've alluded to performing a gap assessment several times throughout this webinar series. And this is really a targeted review of your equipment and your management systems so that you can really understand where your problems are. Now, especially if you're involving operations and maintenance in this, they probably have a good idea of where your problems are. So make sure you're involving the right personnel. But based on the type of material, so whether it's, powders or pellets, and the risk of loss from that area, you will have to determine what practices to implement and what solutions to be able to prevent that material from getting in the surrounding area. So one thing I will throw out there is that a lot of these solutions can be extremely simple. A lot of people overthink this. They think it's gonna, that we need these, $1 million changes in every area. Well, no, a lot of them are pretty simple. And just to kind of walk through the process, an example would be, so for high risk areas, so for example, anywhere that you're handling powder that's close to a fence line, that's an example of a high risk area. Because powders are very difficult to manage once they've hit the ground, if they've entered into a water system. So in this area, you might want to reconsider the equipment or system design. So really taking an engineering control approach of making modifications to that piece of equipment. But for other areas, it may be more appropriate to implement other controls such as procedures or regular maintenance. For example, if you have a piece of equipment that you really only get material on the ground when you open it up for maintenance, then you might want to just consider having a procedure in place to where you're having temporary containment down and that you have a way of recovering that material without sending it to your containment systems. Lastly, your entire site will likely rely on some form of recovery. And when I say recovery, that means anytime the material enters the waterways, that's pulling your internal water systems, that's pulling that material out of the water before you're discharging. And then containment, meaning these physical barriers to prevent the material from getting out from your water systems. This is the last line of defense and should be treated that way. I've heard from many of our peers that historically this has become a dependency that some have had, that these systems were intended to be a last line of defense, but they've become dependent on them. And I think it's important that we really do treat those as last line of defense. However, if you're just getting started on your OCS journey, it might be helpful to approach this backwards. As you're getting those improvements to equipment or your system design in place, it might be helpful to actually start at your, for example, your outfall screens, and work your way in as you're tackling issues inside of your manufacturing process. And the reason I say that is because it might take you some time to make the improvements internally. You want to make sure that your last line of defense is really robust enough to manage anything that's getting to that point while you're making those internal improvements. So now that's kind of the approach to preventing losses. Patrick, you can go to the next slide. So what are some actual examples? So these are just a couple that we have gathered. I will reiterate, the purpose of this webinar is not just for us to talk to you guys. We have a lot to learn from you. So we are sending out the survey for everyone to benefit from. Please submit your best practices on that survey. If you hear something that, you know, Chris or Jerry or I talk about today, and you say, hey, we do something a little bit different, it works really well for us, please submit those on the survey, and that way we can send those out to all participants, because you know, and this is really a full value chain effort, and we need everyone's ideas. So the first thing that I will just talk through is just a couple of things on product handling. So this is going to be for fluff or for pellets, or for flakes or chunks, the many names of the plastics that we manage internally. An example of something that can be done from a design standpoint. So a best practice for anywhere that you have equipment that is open to the atmosphere. So if you have sometimes open-ended pipes where material can come out and is usually collected in a box, for example. An example of a best practice here to avoid loss to the surrounding area, even if you have a recovery system that is managing it, is ensuring that those pieces of equipment have cones or lids that cover them, and that open-ended pipe system is designed in a way to where you're not going to have material bouncing out of your collection boxes. Oftentimes those open-ended systems are not designed with the box that you're going to be catching the material in mind. And so it's important to make sure that those systems are retrofitted to be able to go into a collection container that can be contained and can be moved when it's full in an efficient way. This is an example of a simple design change for open equipment. So an example of implementing procedures for product handling would be, I've alluded to it a few times, is that anywhere you have equipment that might be, you can open up to the environment during maintenance, during shutdowns, is making sure you have procedures in place to capture that material. For example, if you have a filter housing, that you remove those filters regularly, and that material is a very fine material, you want to make sure you have procedures in place that instruct your maintenance personnel on how to safely remove those filters without allowing those powders to get into the air. And also making sure the disposal is taken into mind. You know, those filters have fine particles on them, making sure that they're not, you know, put into a trash can and sent to the landfill. You want to make sure that those are being, you know, bagged and disposed of properly to make sure that that material is not getting out. Some examples on loadout. So from a design standpoint, a lot of loadout areas are designed with paved areas, but also can have rocky areas around. And this is an example where, you know, if possible, paving those rocky areas, because once pellets bounce into rocks, they can be very difficult to clean up. So that's an example of a design change. If you guys tune in for the webinar in 2 weeks, actually my counterpart from Interplast will be talking about a mesh material that they've actually installed over their rocky areas that's really helped them. And so I think both of those are examples of design changes that can prevent you from getting that material into those rocky areas. Also, enclosing that area, I think, is important. If you have just a covered loading area that's not fully enclosed, that having that area enclosed can also prevent bouncing of material into the nearby surroundings. So an example of a procedure in the loadout area that should be implemented is, you know, if you don't have the money to completely redesign your loading system and you tend to get pellets on the top of your rail cars, is having clear procedures that require you to wash down or blow down your cars after they're loaded, because once they leave your loadout area, it is very difficult, and the worst, you know, the last thing we want to see is that car gets, you know, sent to it gets sent to a terminal or to a customer and has material on the top of it. So that is an example of a procedure. So I'm going to jump lastly to plant-wide containment. I think this is something that it takes, it really deserves a lot of time and focus to make sure your plant is set up for success. The first thing I will say is that your containment should be strategic. And when I say that, I mean avoiding hard to clean up areas. You know, if you know that material is going to hit the ground in one area of your facility, and currently that stream is directed to an earthen ditch, that's something where you should rethink the design to make sure that area is easy to clean up. Are you sending out people to try to vacuum up a grass ditch with material? Even though it's internally, it makes things much more difficult to maintain. So making sure that your containment is strategic. Another, so the closer that you can catch it to the source, the better, and that might mean redirecting flows or putting in sump systems further up in your process. So another example of a design thing is just some extra safeguards, and I just call these the things that allow you to sleep at night. So these are, you know, they might not be directly on your, your outfall screens, although your outfall screens are incredibly important to be designed to where they can handle, you know, very large flows of water in case you have a large rain event. You know, that might look like staging your outfall screens in decreasing size of to capture like your larger materials up front to prevent your bottlenecking at your outfalls. That might also look like installing a sump system in the areas where you see a lot of material before your outfalls. So those kind of considerations are absolutely critical for wherever you're discharging your water. But in addition to that, it could look like extra safeguards. So if that could look like lining your fence with mesh material, and that's just an extra safeguard in case you have very large flows of water, or if you have any kind of material that could blow in the wind. That's really just giving you that kind of extra, peace of mind that you're putting in these extra things on your systems to prevent that ultimate loss to the environment. That could also look like in your parking lots. You might not think that you would ever see plastics in your parking lots, but your employees might get them on their shoes when they're going to the facility. So in addition to having, shoe sweeps before your parking lots, just putting on screens on your parking lot drains. Those systems typically aren't intended to have any plastics in them because it's not by design for the plastics to be there, but that's an extra safeguard that can be taken. The last thing I'll mention on your plant-wide containment is setting your site up for success with your containment, your containers that you're using, and making sure they're very well labeled. Everyone knows where they are, what type of materials that they should have in them, whether it's dirty fluff or floor sweep or cleaner pellets. I highly recommend to build a map for your facility so that you can make sure you have those in place and everyone knows exactly where they are. So this is certainly not an extensive list of practices, but it's just intended to present a few helpful ones and demonstrate this approach. And then we will be sending out more practices from the webinar participants. Patrick, you can go to the last slide. We hope that you guys will submit your practices for this webinar on the survey. We are all in this together to preventing plastic loss to the environment, and we really have to be open to sharing our learnings with the whole industry. So, please visit our website for more of our practices, and I'll turn it back to Patrick.
Thanks, Danielle. That was great. And the best practices on your website are really useful and simple things for people to consider. So when I send this out, that underlying link is a URL. It should be live and you should be able to get there. So with that, I'd like to now hand it off to Chris to talk about the things that we should think about during transloading. So Chris, if you can unmute yourself and then let me know when you would like for me to advance.
Okay, great. Thanks, Patrick. So as been mentioned earlier, we're going to dive into once the product's been manufactured, how do we ship it? How do we transport it safely in a manner that will mitigate any type of safety risk or any leaks to the environment or the community? So a lot of what we discussed, there's different ways of doing it, and that's been mentioned already as well. This is just an effort for us to kind of stir up the conversation and bring in various best practices into the discussion. So please keep that in mind as we go through the steps that we may be discussing one way, but there's several different ways that can be done, And also, just like everyone to also keep in mind that there will be some things that you'll hear in my presentation that you'll probably hear them again in the next one by Mr. Jerry. That's not by accident. That's by design because there are things that should be repeated at each touch point in transportation of a rail car or truck. So to start us off, we can move to the first slide. To start us off, we're going to look at basically the rail car and load out of the rail car. So usually in most operations, ownership of the product for logistics is taken over once the product is loaded into a silo. Now, however, with logistics, the steps in ensuring a safe load start much earlier than that. So it actually starts when you receive the empty rail car to your facility. When that rail car arrives at your site, the very first thing you want to do is you want to inspect it. And the things you're looking for are the things that make that rail car travel worthy, that it's in a safe, you're looking at the safety appliances and different parts of the rail car to ensure that once it's moved on a rail track, whether that's inside your facility or after you load it and you release it, that it's safe to travel, that you won't have issues with wheels, you won't have issues with safety appliances, you won't have issues with side rails, anything along those lines that might impact the transportation of that rail car. Now, typically in most operations, you move next into to a stage where the rail car is cleaned, and that step, there's another inspection. And you're going to hear inspections and checklists throughout this presentation because that's very important. And I should have mentioned it before in the beginning, but you should also have a very robust procedure development, as well as a process in place for MOCing or updating procedures or your processes. Because as you go through these processes, your people will find better ways of doing it and safer ways of doing it. So you want to have a process to capture that feedback, and you want to keep in mind that going back to when you receive the rail car and you wash it, this next step, when you wash the rail car, it's not just a matter of washing it, but for cleanliness, it's also an opportunity for you to inspect the rail car. You want to look at the interior of the rail car. You want to look at the exterior of the rail car. You want to look at the gates. You want to look at gaskets. And as you're washing it, you want to look for anything that would identify a missing gasket or a piece section of a gasket missing, or a loose, any appliance of the rail car that's loose that would lead to a leak. And a lot of times that's very hard to do from a visual inspection, but as first pass is a very ideal time to do that. You want to try to identify any issues with that rail car that you possibly can at that stage so that it can be repaired before moving on further in your process. And the next step, once you get it clean and it's identified as fit for loading, you want to bring the rail car over to your load rack. And here again, you want to perform another inspection. And this time you want to do a preload inspection. And at this point, this is when your loader should be looking at the rail car, and he should be looking for anything that would make that rail car unsuitable for him to load product into. Once he deems that it's good, fit for loading, he should load the rail car, and there's many types of systems, devices that can be used to load rail cars to achieve the desired load that you're looking for. That's a different discussion. But once the rail car is loaded, you want to perform a post-load inspection. And a part of that post-load inspection, you want to look to make sure there's nothing you missed, that there's nothing that would deem that rail car unsuitable for releasing into transportation. There's no leaks, there's no product left over on top of the rail car. You want to make sure that the top is clean, all the hatch areas are clean, the ends of the rail car especially are clean and free from any type of material or older material that may have been missed during the wash process. And once that's done and you've deemed that rail car is suitable for transportation, and this should be after you've you've closed up and secured the rail car, and polyethylene is non-hazardous. So typically you have a sealing program in place that's in hazardous goods, it's a sealing for security of the product in, but typically you have some type of sealing program in place for maintaining the quality of your product. And once you've done that, the rail car is released to the to your carrier, your rail carrier. Now, the thing about the rail carrier, this is the first point to where you have lost control of that rail car. So you want to make sure everything is in compliance to prevent any type of releases that are not due to an accident prior to releasing that rail car. And as the slide mentions, there's 3 different avenues that a rail car can travel in. One is directly to the converter. The second one, it can go to a bulk transport where it's transloaded into a truck, and then it ships to a converter. Now, what's important about that is each of these end destinations, whether it's railed directly from you to the converter, or it's from you to the bulk carrier, or it's from you to a converter, a bagging operation. All of 3 of those are considered end destinations. Once they're received at that end destination, they have now received the rail car, and your responsibilities as a shipper have ended. And once they release that empty rail car to you, they take on the same responsibilities for inspecting and ensuring that that rail car is safe for travel prior to releasing it back to you. And if we can move to the next slide. And this one is just a slide to demonstrate that if you load directly into a truck for bulk transport, the operation it can leave, you want to perform the same inspections, the interior inspection that you would perform on a rail car and the exterior inspection. Typically, you'll have your carrier there at the time of loading, and he's responsible for that load once it's on the roadway. So he's going to want to participate in that inspection, or he's going to want to inspect it after you to make sure that it's roadworthy as well. And here again, it can go directly to a converter, or it can go directly to a bagging operation. And if you do that, you just have to keep in mind that the same inspection as a shipper, you want to ensure that the rail car, that the bulk truck is properly secured. And if you have a sealing program, which you should, it's properly sealed and accounted for prior to releasing it. So what I'd really emphasize that we draw from this is that we have very robust and checklists, and we have robust procedures, because the way that we sustain and we provide repeatability in each and every rail car that we load, or truck that we load, it's going to be through our procedures and the in-depth of our procedures. And also that we really want to remember that it's important that our front line, they need to understand the intent of the inspection and checklist. This is so that it really goes back to Danielle's point about the hearts and mind, because a lot of times, unless you're going to have an encyclopedia size of procedures, you have to help people to understand the intent. What are you trying to accomplish? When you say, if you're inspecting the top man lids, what are you inspecting it for? Why do you do it? What are the consequences of not doing that? So that really reaches the heart and minds, and it drives the intent, and it helps people improve our processes, which as business grows, we're gonna need improvements in the process. And that's basically a brief overall. And what I'll do now is hand it back to Patrick as we move into what happens when it reaches some of those end destinations.
Thanks, Chris. Really appreciate that. Yeah, those graphics really highlight how many different pieces there are. And as you said, inspections and procedures are important. So at this point, we will go to Jerry. And again, I'd like to remind people about the Q&As at the end if we have time. So please feel free to add them. If your questions aren't answered either today or by the presentations, we will work to ensure that our published document of best practices helps kind of speak to some of those questions as well. So Jerry, if you are unmuted, I will hand it off to you. Just let me know when you'd like to advance.
All right, well, thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Chris. Great presentations. Thank you, everybody, for attending today, and thank you for your dedication to achieving zero Pell loss. So with that, we can advance. Patrick? In order to help reach zero Pell loss, these few tasks are crucial to your success. Keep it in mind why it's important. That's helping the environment, safety and health of the public. You know, we've heard many of these things throughout the morning or throughout the day here. And as they mentioned, we continue to hear them because it is very critical in each one of our segments. Implementing your plan, clear guidance of your company's procedures, protocols, policies, proper training. It is clear to make sure that we communicate what's expected of each of us to achieve zero Pell loss. You know, as leaders in the industry and in our organizations, it's key that we have all the proper measures in place to prevent Pell loss and monitor our processes. You know, we must keep zero Pell loss in the forefront of our minds as well as the employees' minds. So, next slide, please. In a transload facility, many people ask, where can you get started? Where can you make a difference? You know, we heard some great ideas from Danielle and Chris earlier. And, you know, again, as they may seem redundant, but they're not. They carry through the entire sector here. So next slide, please. This is where it starts. Zero Pell loss starts the moment you receive the rail car. You know, Chris talked earlier, they hand it off now to the rail. Now we receive it. You know, we receive the rail cars, and again, as Chris said, we must make sure that we perform the proper inspections. Are we inspecting the right things? Are we doing their job? You know, as leadership, we have an accountability to follow up to see that these inspections are being performed correctly, you know, to prevent pellet loss. Next slide, please. First point of contact on the incoming rail car is to reduce pellet loss in your facility. As we spoke earlier, the dome lids, are they secured? Are they sealed? Top of the rail car is free of pellets, excellently released during the loading process. Both Danielle and Chris spoke of this. You know, these can be troublesome. You know, if a facility is located close to a load facility and it comes into a transload facility, now during inclement weather, the pellets can be washed off the top of these cars into your gravel areas where it's hard to clean. You know, the draft tubes, are they secured and sealed properly? They show no signs of evidence or damage or tampering during transit or leakage. You know, if they do, we need to report them. Make sure your people know who to report to, how they report them, how do they prevent further release of the material if it gets on site. You know, it's critical that we really communicate to our employees and to the people that they understand what's expected of them when things are non-conforming. Next slide, please. Ways to reduce pellet loss while loading. It's containment. catch pans are in place prior to transfer. Before any rail cars are opened up, make sure you have the proper containment in place. You can see in the photos there, underneath the hopper outlet, you have containment device, but also you have a secondary underneath the catch pan. So in case there is spillage, secondary containment is key. You know, make sure the draft tubes are closed after each use and resealed if there's product in there. If there's product remained in that compartment, it's key that we communicate that to somebody in a manner of sealing the back up. You know, additionally, you'll see there that the hoses have securement devices that hold them to the rail car. It might be hard to see in the photo, but if you look close, there's ropes there to help support that hose holding it into that rail car so it can't come off. Additionally, there's also cam lock straps to make sure the ears of the hoses don't come open where the hose can accidentally fall off. Then you have a hose stand to help support the hose. Supporting the hose in all these manners keeps it from coming disconnected from the rail car. Even on the opposite end where the draft tube draws the air, you have a screen on the other side with the same primary and secondary containment devices in place to prevent any spillage. Next slide, please. Secondary containment, it goes well past the loading or transfer process. It's important not to only implement secondary containment while loading, but also throughout the facility, as we heard earlier as well. We have to make sure we have measures in place. You can see in the manhole there's screens to catch any spillage. There's an example of one of them screens on the right there you'll see that fits down the manhole. Them are key to make sure they're in place, but also they're key to make sure they're maintained. Do we clean them? Do we check them? Do we take them out? Them should be done on a regular basis part of your inspection to ensure that they do let the water out and maintain keeping pellets from being released into the environment. We must continue to monitor all outlets of the waterways. Next slide, please. Continuing ways to reduce pellet loss. Management plays key role in zero pellet loss. It's through continuous education and training. It's frequent facility audits. New and existing employee and education training to ensure proper loading procedures. You can see there, make sure that you cover the areas as much as possible. We said that earlier many times. Covering your areas with asphalt, keeping the amount of gravel or similar surfaces like that to a minimum is key. You know, it's really starts from a management level and a culture, as Danielle said earlier. It's a culture starts from the top and works its way all the way down. Next slide, please. And having the proper accidental release procedures. You know, we talked about that earlier. Through multiple preventative measures are put in place to help prevent accidental releases. There are also accessible tools in place to prevent them. Are the brooms and dustpans, are they easily accessible? Do they have access to vacuums, scrap and recycling containers? Do we dispose of them properly? Do we know who our emergency contact? Do we communicate that? Is it posted? Proper reporting procedures in place. Proper documentation, was it completed during a spill? And did we do a proper root cause analysis performed with the procedures, with the proper procedures in place? We need to look at, if we do have a spill, how and why it happened. We should have the proper measures in place to prevent these. But in the event we do have a spill, how did it happen? What are we going to do to prevent it from happening in the future again? And therefore your teamwork comes together and we look at and say, who has accountability and where does it lie, and make the proper corrections. With that, I think next slide, if there's any questions, I think I hand it off to you, Patrick.
Thanks, Jerry. And I think we're all going to turn on our videos to wrap this up at the end. But yeah, so we are at the question and answers part of our session. We only have a few minutes, which, as I mentioned, is not shocking when we want to schedule these and fill them as much as possible. So we have a lot of questions that were previously asked, and then we have a few questions from our Q&A as well. So the one that I would like to discuss first is for rail cars, how do you ensure that the caps are not tampered with in transit, either to or from the facility? Chris, I think you talked a little bit about sealing programs. I'm curious, is that a way that works? Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the sealing program is because it's non-hazardous, so it's basically leveraging hazardous material requirements, which require a seal, and depending on what the product is, it even tells you what type of seal it is, and those are issued under CT-PAD under the Department of Homeland Security. But what you typically want to do is have a process in place to where you seal your rail car, and each seal is identified by some distinguishing mark. Well, and usually that's an alphanumeric tag or stencil on the seal itself. When you document those seal numbers, a lot of people do this for quality measures to ensure that it hasn't been tampered with, or at least they would know. And then the second piece of it would fall in good communications with your customer. If you seal the rail car, they should understand your customer should understand exactly how they'll receive the rail car, what seals will be on it, what seal numbers, and if they receive anything different, the customer needs to feed that back to you and let you know that, so you can do research and determine if something happened along the way. There are measures that you can take in rail, such as working with your carrier. If your customer identified that that the car was unsealed when they received it, you definitely sealed it. There are things you can do with working with a rail carrier. There's an AAR police that you can work with to identify if you have tampering in between its shipping point and destination.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. So we have time for one more pretty quick question, and I'm going to hand that to Danielle. And that's going to say, how are potential concerns reported? Do you encourage the people to formally use a form? Is there some ad hoc form that, sending this to a member of management? What is the recommendation for sharing concerns?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that having that open culture with sharing what can be improved is so important. I will say two quick things. Number one, make sure you have an internal reporting mechanism that you can, these would typically be falling out of your non-reportable events. So this is not going to be something leaving your outfall, or it's an environmental reportable. Having a mechanism internally through your incident reporting to report spills or areas of concern. The second thing is having those be able to be reported during housekeeping walkthroughs. And then third, get creative. One thing that we've done at a site, we've made it fun, where we actually offer prizes for solutions for certain areas that we're looking for solutions for. So those are all ways that you can encourage that feedback and get everyone involved.
Great, thanks, Danielle. So we are nearing the end of the hour, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I will say that several of the Q&A submissions that were received were actually interesting scenarios where it was a specific instance or question. So please feel free to send those to me directly. We have an Operation Clean Sweep Blue team, and a lot of times we discuss those sorts of things on the call. So we can get better answers for specifics. And then also, like Danielle said, it's a really nice way to kind of create and think creatively about finding solutions. So as I wrap up, I'd like to thank you all for participating, as well as our speakers for being able to present and answering your questions today and follow up. As a reminder, please fill out the survey to make sure that you get a copy of the slides and a recording of this webinar. It's the only way to get a copy of the slides and the recording before mid-October. And also, don't forget to register to attend our third webinar in the series if you haven't yet, and that's on September 29th. So thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.